Well, thank you for having me here. I have a vague recollection of having spoken in a room like this, but I'm not sure if it's the same room a couple of years ago. Are all the rooms the same, the quad rooms? Oh, it's the same room. Okay, so I haven't quite lost my mind yet. That's reassuring. Normally, I would have spent most of the duration of my remarks speaking about Gaza and also the Mavi Marmara, what happened on the flotilla on May 31st. But now there are serious developments unfolding quite literally as I speak and as you sit in the audience, which may culminate in something quite awful in Lebanon. I don't like to use the word conspiracy or plot, but sometimes there are conspiracies and plots. In 1956, the tripartite invasion of the Suez was a conspiracy and a plot. And it seems to me that those words do apply to what's now unfolding as the Western powers concert with Israel to prepare for a softening up of Lebanon with the longer-term goal of ridding Lebanon of the Hezbollah, the party of God. And those are really, I think, quite sinister machinations that are going on now, which might culminate or climax in something really terrible. So I will devote a significant part of my remarks to looking at what's happening there. And even though I don't like to speculate, because speculation is the sort of thing where if you get it wrong, you look very foolish in retrospect. But here I will curb the concerns of my ego, and I will speculate because I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, beginning right now, to prepare for, and to the extent possible, to avert what's being planned for that unfortunate, hapless place in the world. I'll begin by looking at what happened in Gaza in 2008-9, then look at what happened on the Freedom Flotilla. But the story actually begins, if time allowed me, the story actually begins in May 2000, when after a 17-year-long guerrilla war, the Hezbollah, the party of God, evicted the Israeli occupying army from South Lebanon. Israel was determined to undo that defeat and restore what it calls its deterrence capacity. Deterrence capacity is one of those polysyllabic terms that people invent to try to convince you that they know something that you don't, which is rarely the case, especially when it comes to political scientists, and usually the reverse is closer to the truth. All it means is to restore the Arab world's fear of Israel. The Israeli viewpoint being Arabs and Muslims only understand the language of force. The Israelis, having suffered the defeat in May 2000, they need to restore the Arab world's fear of it. They have to use force successfully. And so already from 2001, they began planning and preparing for the next round against the Hezbollah. They waited patiently for a pretext. The pretext came in the summer of 2006, and then Israel unleashed the full force of its army and air force, primarily its air force. But unexpectedly, Israel suffered another defeat in Lebanon at the hands of the party of God. And now Israel was determined it had to score a victory. Couldn't yet target Lebanon because it wasn't militarily prepared for yet another tangle with Hezbollah. And so they chose Gaza, and Gaza was the place where Israel was going to restore its deterrence capacity, the Arab world's fear of it. The background to the Gaza assault or invasion has been fairly rapidly erased from the historical record. Actually, even Gaza and what happened in Gaza has been erased. So, for example, 3 days ago, the senior New York Times correspondent in the Middle East, Ethan Bronner, he was discussing the so-called peace process and doing a retrospective, and he said that, and I'm quoting him, the Israel-Palestine conflict has been drained of any violence in the last few years. So there was no violence in Gaza in 2008, 2009. The background really begins January 2006, when there were parliamentary elections in the occupied Palestinian territories. And unexpectedly, Hamas, the Islamic movement, came out the victor. The former U.S. President, Jimmy Carter, he was one of the international observers at the elections, and he said they were, I'm quoting him, completely honest and fair. In fact, these were the first elections in the Arab world where a sitting government was voted out of power and a new party came in to replace it. The second case will be Iraq, assuming that the coalition government is formed after the elections. Well, Israel and the United States were not happy with the result of the election, so they punished the people of Gaza for exercising their democratic rights and imposed a blockade and economic sanctions on Gaza. About a year and a half later, June 2007, the Americans and the Israelis were growing impatient with Hamas retaining power, and so the Americans, the Israelis, and some elements among the Palestinian leadership, they attempted a coup to overthrow the elected government. The coup proved unsuccessful, and now the United States, Israel, they tightened the blockade of Gaza. Amnesty International called the blockade a flagrant violation of international law. Richard Goldstone and his mission, which was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council, Richard Goldstone later said that the blockade of Gaza was a possible crime against humanity. Around this time, the Irish human rights activist Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza, and she said, and now I quote her, she said, Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. In 2008, in June 2008, Egypt brokered a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. And under the terms of the ceasefire, each side had obligations. On the side of Hamas, they had to stop the rocket and mortar attacks against Israel. And on the side of Israel, Israel had to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law, the blockade which was destroying a civilization. Now, according to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now I'm quoting them, they said Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel reneged on its obligation to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. What happened next? Well, here the record is quite straightforward, easy enough for a British citizen To check it, all you have to do is look at Amnesty International's yearbook for 2009. And if you open their yearbook, you'll read the following. A ceasefire agreed in June 2008 between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. It held for 4.5 months. But it broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on November 4th. Beginning roughly around March 2007, Israel had been preparing the attack on Gaza. And by mid-2008, all the pieces were in place. And now all they needed was the pretext, the excuse to go into Gaza. They patiently waited till November 4th, the American election day, knowing full well that the attention of the media and of the public would be riveted to the results of the historic election in the U.S. And on that day, November 4th, Israel invaded Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that that would evoke or provoke Hamas rocket and mortar attacks. And Israel wanted the rocket and mortar attacks because it needed the pretext to launch the assault on Gaza. But you know those Islamicists, those crazy Muslims, they're so stubborn and they're so fanatical. So Hamas kept saying through the end of December, Hamas kept saying, we're ready to renew the ceasefire. We're prepared to renew the ceasefire. But Israel has to meet its obligations under the ceasefire. It has to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. Israel said no. Hamas had to stop its rocket and mortar attacks, but Israel would not lift the blockade of Gaza. By the end of December, Sarah Roy of Harvard University, the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, she also happens to be the daughter of a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp. Sarah Roy wrote in the London Review of Books, she said, the breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us in Gaza, but there is little international response beyond UN warnings which are ignored. And at this point, the people of Gaza, Hamas, they were confronted with 2 stark options. One was to acquiesce in their gradual, their incremental destruction. Or 2, to resist, to fight. Hamas opted to resist, although it must be said that the resistance was largely symbolic. The former Israeli commander in Gaza, he said, speaking to his fellow Israeli citizens, he said, you cannot just land blows, leave the Palestinians in Gaza in economic distress, and expect that Hamas will just sit around and do nothing. It's easy enough to condemn Hamas for its rocket and mortar attacks on Israel, and all the human rights organizations did so. But it seems to me that you then have the obligation of showing what should Hamas have done. What was its other option? If you don't present another option, you're in effect saying the people of Gaza had a legal and moral obligation to just lie still and die. In any event, on December 27th, Israel decided to expedite the process, and it invaded Gaza. The assault lasted 22 days till January 18th, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction. Well, what did happen during those 22 days? Nowadays, when people refer back to a